I'd like to thank John Rao and all of the staff at Open Minds for making this conference possible. It's such a pleasure to be with you again this year. And as Alejandro said, my lecture this year is something very different than what I usually do. You might think of me as being a person who looks for evidence, scientifically oriented. I like to collect physical evidence for scientific analysis, and also to do archival research on the history of government involvement in the investigation of UFOs, and on their decision to cover up their findings, and the people who were involved in the cover-up. But this year, I'm talking about perplexing phenomena, and here we go. I'm going out on a limb. This is something totally different from me, and it's very controversial. It stirs up strong emotions in some people. It's something that I used to ignore, and it's something that most field investigators, UFO investigators, ignore. Probably because it is so controversial. I'm going to be talking about psi phenomena related to contact, something that you might possibly think of as paranormal phenomena, something you might think of as high strangeness phenomena. And so this is something that's different for me, something that I used to ignore even though it was there. Somehow I didn't think it was related. So let's move on. I became fully aware of how prevalent this is in 2012 when I collated the results of a research study that Denise Stoner and I did. It was a year-long study, and we were looking for commonalities among experiencers. The questionnaire had 45 questions, we had 50 experiencers, and we had a 25-person control group, people who had never had a contact experience or witnessed a UFO. And one of the questions that Denise wanted to ask was, have you witnessed paranormal activity in your home? And if so, what did you observe? I didn't understand why she really wanted to put that on there, but I agreed. And at the end, 88% stated that they had observed paranormal phenomena in their homes. We asked what? And generally, it was light orbs that seemed to be intelligently controlled, or something like poltergeist phenomena, things flying off from shelves. So that was very, very interesting to me. 51% said that this was related to contact and began after their first contact. The Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Encounters, of which I am on the board of directors and was also a consultant to their study, found that 75% of their participants stated that they had this kind of contact, this kind of observation. So I came up with a definition of what this is. I call it high strangeness, and it is perplexing contact phenomena that fall outside our current scientific knowledge and understanding and do not lend themselves to scientific investigation using our current scientific paradigm, yet are reported too often to ignore. This is the late, great Dr. Berthold Schwartz. And if you've been in this field for a long time, you are probably aware of him. He was a psychiatrist, prominent psychiatrist, who was an investigator of psi phenomena related to contact. And he wrote, quote, even though many UFO researchers try to ignore the psychic component of UFOs, the rejection of this key element will only contribute to the continuing confusion that surrounds the phenomenon, close quote. He was a very good friend of my Aunt Betty Hill. They communicated with each other for something like 20 or 30 years. And in private correspondence to him, she wrote, quote, "These things are happening to Barney and me as well as to my relatives, but they have also been witnessed by other people who were present. We do not believe in ghosts, but we do believe in space travel and life on other planets. So we wonder if these space travelers might have the ability to be unseen to us." I wrote about that a little bit in one of the chapters in my book with Stanton Friedman, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. And I actually did witness some of this in my childhood home, but it wasn't until I was about ready to leave for college. It started, as far as my brothers and I can determine, after 1966. And something important happened in 1966. That is that a craft was observed landing on my grandparents' farm. My childhood home was across the street from my grandparents' farm. My grandmother saw it coming in for a landing, and a neighbor of ours, who was a commercial pilot, saw it coming in as well. It left some physical trace evidence on the ground, splayed out some trees. But it seems that after that landing is when we started to have these weird things happening in my childhood home. And my family would talk about it when I would be home from college, and thinking that I was a real smarty pants because I was a freshman in college, and in my psychology book it said that paranormal phenomena is psychic or psychologically generated. I thought, oh, this is nonsense. Something is going on with my family. I think they're getting too carried away with this. And then in 1968, in the summer of 68, my boyfriend at the time decided to spend the night at my parents' home. We had an ocean-faring boat, and we were going to take a family fishing trip the next day. He was sleeping in my brother's bedroom, and some of this activity was going on, some poltergeist activity, some light orbs in my brother's room. We didn't even think about that because, of course, I thought it was nonsense. My brother was away in the Army at the time, and in the middle of the night, we were awakened by him screaming and yelling and running from the house. And he didn't want to enter the house again because the coat hangers had lifted out of my brother's closet and landed on top of him and woke him up. And that was something that I couldn't ignore. It had kind of a negative impact on our relationship. Then in 1977, my husband and I were living in Colorado, and we went home for a family vacation. We were staying in my childhood home. The only double bed in the house was my mother's bed, and so she slept in one of the twin beds that we had when we were growing up, my two brothers and I. And during the night, we were awakened by what felt like a cat walking around on the bed. So we tried to grab the cat to throw it out of the bedroom, and we couldn't find it. So we turned on the light. No cat. He got out of bed. He looked all over the room for the cat, under the bed. We couldn't find the cat. And so I don't remember if we woke my mother up that night or if we waited until the next morning. What I do remember is that she said there was no cat in that room, but it has happened to her as well. That was a question that I decided that I would ask experiencers because others were reporting this kind of thing to me, and I always thought, well, maybe they had a dead cat, and maybe it was the ghost of the cat walking on the bed. So actually, we found out that 62% of experiencers have had that bed walking kind of experience on their beds. And then in 1983, I was again staying at my mother's home. I had 2 young children at the time, and my 5-year-old son was staying in that haunted bedroom, my brother's bedroom. And so in the middle of the night, I was awakened by him romping around the room, wreaking havoc in there. Got up out of bed, opened the bedroom door. He had left the nightlight on, and there he was running and jumping, trying to bat an orb. I was really startled by that, so I scooped him up and took him into my bedroom, and I asked him the next day what that was all about, if he knew, and he said, "Oh, well, that's the guy who comes to play with me at night." So that was very startling. The first thing I wanted to do was find a prosaic explanation for it. Could it have been ball lightning? Could it have been plasma? But I realized that the weather conditions were not right for that to have occurred. There was no road outside the house. It was impossible for it to have been headlights or anything else. So very, very perplexing. These are some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to break them all down, and I'll be showing you a little bit of video and some photographs as well. And at the end of all of this, then I'm going to present to you the most perplexing investigation that I have ever worked on in my life. I think you'll find it perplexing too. So light orbs in homes. 60% of the people on MUFON's experiencer questionnaire stated that they had observed these in their homes. It was 66% on freeze. So here are just some of the orbs that I have collected. You know, you always think that maybe they are dust orbs, and I wouldn't want to make a firm conclusion on that. But then I received the next one that I'm going to show you in motion. The very interesting thing about this orb was I had been investigating this case for about 3 years at that time. And the experiencer had gotten in touch with me, and he told me that he had these swollen glands or nodes on the side of his neck. And so he went to the doctor, and he got a prescription, and they didn't go away. They kept growing and growing. And the next thing I knew, he said that he was going before a team of oncologists, and that he was going to be having surgery, and he was very, very worried. But he was hoping that he would be healed. So he was going to ask ETs to give him some healing. And then he sent me this video. And the nodes, after this occurred, when he woke up the following morning, were very, very tiny in comparison to what they had been when he went to bed that night. And by the time he had surgery, he had only 4 tiny necrotizing nodes removed. Healings. On the MUFON experiencer questionnaire, 10% of our participants stated that they had healings. And at that point, we had 400 participants. Some of the things that they stated they had been healed from were cancer, heart disease, lung disease, chronic mononucleosis, and short-term memory loss. I have a few medical reports. More research has to be done to verify this. So this was experiencers reporting to me without adequate proof to back that up. But I do have some medical reports. This is just my kitchen. It's not real poltergeist activity. But, so I just wanted to mention that, things flying off from shelves, things tipping over, pictures flying off from walls, that sort of thing is reported. And also, we always hear about experiencers who state that they have been taken from their homes, generally at night, and they have passed through a solid surface, such as a window or a wall or the ceiling. My Aunt Betty and I always used to argue about this, and she'd say, well, Kathy, if somebody told me that happened to them, I'd ask them for the repair bill. And I would argue, and I'd say, well, maybe they have developed technology that we don't even know about. And she would not believe that that was really taking place. But I wanted to check with some physicists about this. So I asked 3 theoretical physicists, and this is basically what they told me. They said that nothing is completely solid, theoretically, and that everything has a kind of a vibration. And so, energized particles at a high enough vibrational frequency become invisible or dematerialize. 99% of the atom is empty space between the protons and the electrons. So it is a matter of getting things in alignment to get them to interpenetrate. And this has actually been done on a very, very small scale in a laboratory, they told me. So it is theoretically possible. Disappearances and returns. I hear about that so often, where, in one case I had an experiencer who was keeping a camera next to her bed so that she was going to try to photograph an extraterrestrial or non-human entity. And all of a sudden, she had an experience and the camera simply disappeared. She and her family looked for the camera for a couple of weeks, and then it reappeared in a very conspicuous place. Also, in 1991, a Texas woman lost her driver's license. It was tightly lodged in her wallet. She looked every place for it and could never find it. So she replaced the license, and then she moved 3 times to 2 different states. And each time she turned in her license and replaced it. Well, in 2016, 25 years later, she had taken her car out to have it serviced in the morning. She drove home into her garage, and there was that Texas driver's license that she lost in 1991 lying on the garage floor. She hadn't been unpacking boxes. It was just there. Very startling. It caused me to wonder if there were time slips taking place or interdimensional membranes, and then maybe something would just slip in to somewhere and somewhen and slip out at another time in another place following that person. I don't know, but it's something that I'd like to know. Also, she had bought a dining room set, and she had it for 17 years. It was an oak dining room set. And she is a single woman. She has cameras around her house. She has very good security. She's a professional woman. She is serious. She is mentally and emotionally stable. And one day, one of her chairs simply vanished. It has not been returned yet. And so I'm dying. I'm just waiting for that chair to be returned. And one of her paintings disappeared off her wall, too, in a very, very strange way. Manifestations out of thin air, ports. Bert Schwartz used to talk about this. You can see Katie, one of his subjects, on the bottom left. See if I can point the arrow at her without advancing that. There's Katie. And he actually photographed this apport as it was appearing on her body, on her skin, and on the chair that she was sitting on. Well, Audrey Hewins, who is here, is on the top left, and Audrey is an experiencer. She's the experiencer who started Starborn Support. And my co-author of the alien abduction files, Denise Stoner, was at Audrey's family's home in Maine. And she was up there because she was taking part in a television production. A Japanese television production company was there. And what happened is that an apport suddenly appeared. And Denise has made a little video, and she's going to describe to you what she saw. So, I guess if I can click that.
While on a TV production in Maine, I was on a break while Debbie and Audrey Hewen were being interviewed by the TV crew. And as I observed, they were in a room just across from me. Some substance came from somewhere and began to cover their clothing, their hair, the coffee table, and other objects in the room. I got up immediately and began to collect it in a jar. There was white snowy substance, a crystally substance, and another mixture. I wrapped it up, never touched it, put it in plastic, covered it up, and brought it home for scientists to examine to see what it was made up of. When I got it home, got it to the scientists, and we opened it up, unwrapped it, there was nothing left in the jar, and we have never discovered what the cause was or where it went to.
Very mystifying. Here are some more things that I'm going to be covering next. Telepathy and psi. On the Marden and Stoner commonality study, 88% stated that they had received telepathic messages. 43% had visions. 35% sensed electrical tingling shocks through their bodies, particularly when they were on a table in a craft, they believed. 60% said intuitive and psychic ability increased in association with their contact, and 27% stated that they had been given information of ecological or nuclear devastation on Earth. These shapeshifters, what are they? Are they perceptual distortions by humans? Are they manifestations, actually some kind of non-humans who can just manifest in whatever shape they want to be? Or are these non-humans doing something to our minds, causing us to see things that aren't really there, such as giant owls? That is the most common one reported by experiencers. And I had one case that I worked on in Florida. A group of young people were returning home from a concert at night. They had a designated driver who had not been drinking. They're going through a swampy, kind of desolate area in Florida, and all of a sudden, there is a giant owl standing in the road, much larger than any owl in Florida, according to the Audubon Society. We checked on that. And so the driver had to stop the car. And what happened next was the owl walked around to the driver's side, stood at the door, and stared up at the driver. And so that was pretty strange owl behavior, I thought. And so I said, well, what happened next? And he said, well, I don't know. Next thing I remember is I was just driving down the road again, and my passengers were saying, that was really weird. They did not know if they had missing time or not. In the book, The Alien Abduction Files, I wrote about Jenny Henderson, and one night Jenny Henderson recalled having an alien abduction. And her little child at the time, who was about 2 years old, 3 years old, said the next morning, "Mommy, I played with Bugs Bunny all night long." So many children describe them as looking like rabbits. So he thought that he was playing with a rabbit. And I also had a case in Colorado, and in that case, the man was driving over Monarch Pass, this very high pass that divides the eastern and western slopes. He had stopped in Salida. He had gotten gas. This is at night that he's traveling. He ascended almost to the summit of Monarch Pass when he saw a peach-colored fuzzy light coming at him very, very rapidly. The next thing he knew, there were 3 deer standing in the road in front of him, and there was a lighted area, kind of backlighted, behind these deer. And the next thing he knew, he was down at the bottom of the pass again, near Salida, where he had been, and he was missing a couple of hours' time. Very strange. Bud Hopkins used to hypnotize people, and he would talk about how they would realize under hypnosis that these were not actually owls or deer or whatever. They were little gray entities standing in the road. Here are some other things that we asked about on MUFON's questionnaire. 59% said that their lights blinked out or turned off after an experience. I didn't get a quantitative amount for batteries dying, but people wrote that in, and a lot of people wrote that in. I had open-ended questions there, too. Computer malfunctions, 47%. Appliances burning out right after an experience, 30%. Appliances turning on by themselves, 26%. Digital watch that wouldn't keep time, 23%. Time clock malfunctions only for them, 20%. And scanners in stores malfunction only for them, about 18%. Shadow entities. I've heard a lot about that too. And I have outlined this photograph of a shadow entity. That's part of the last case that I'm going to be discussing. So this is a photograph taken by the witness. So what could be happening? What are some of the hypotheses? Well, could these be dimensional membranes? Could an area in our physical space fall outside our visual range on the electromagnetic spectrum? Theoretically, there may be other creatures that fall in and out of our dimension from time to time. And that comes more from the paranormal field. And sometimes you'll see photographs of what they believe are dimensional membranes. And this is one photograph I received from that case in Texas I'll be talking about. I don't know if that was just dust blowing up or if it was a dimensional membrane, but there was a lot going on there that was very perplexing. Also, could it be a parallel universe or a multiverse? Other areas that are not visible to us exist in the same space and time in a multidimensional universe. There are billions of other universes like bubbles, and at times 2 universes come together, and matter from one enters the other. They twist around the other and create a bridge to the other. Perhaps other intelligences can watch us, but we can't see them. So maybe that's something that's invisible that's going on. But sometimes in the paranormal field, it seems that a human can be watching another intelligence, such as a ghost, and the ghost does not realize they're there, and vice versa, perhaps. And this is that very interesting case that I have been working on in Texas. Melvin got in touch with me in 2014. MUFON had investigated this case before me way back in 2010. He had an associate's degree in airport management, a 4-year program at Lamar University. He had a commercial pilot's license with instrument and multi-engine ratings. He was a flight instructor, and he ran an FAA certified repair station at the time that this happened. He had been in business and doing what he did best for 29 years and had no interest in UFOs. But all of a sudden, something very strange started to take place at his airport. And unfortunately, I have to say that last fall, as things were getting very, very interesting, and I was getting deeper and deeper into this investigation, he passed away very suddenly. This is the airport. The closest residence is about 2 miles away. There are 2 churches very close to the airport, and it's really kind of an industrial zone on the outskirts of a town. It is a heavily wooded area, and it is abutted by tribal land. You can see the area in Texas. There are national forests around that area as well. So his first UFO sighting was in September 2010. And there were 5 individuals out on the runway. He heard people out there. He was living at the airport. He had bought land, and he and his wife were going to build a house on the land that he had purchased there. But they were staying temporarily in an apartment right connected to the hangar and the workshop that went along with the airport. And so one night his attention was focused upon some noise that was going on outside. He went out there, and there were 5 people standing out there looking into the sky. And so this is what he wrote. And I want to quote him because I thought he was so descriptive in what he wrote and so intelligent in what he wrote. And of course, I considered him to be credible because you have to be a pretty credible person to have a commercial pilot's license. They don't just give them out to nuts. So this is what he said. I was working late in the shop one night when I heard what sounded like people talking. I walked outside to find 5 individuals gathered together and pointing toward the southeast. I looked and watched as this brightly lit, pulsating light in the night sky was coming from the east and zipping through the sky, stopping over the town. It also appeared to be accompanied by another craft, some 10 to 15,000 feet above it. It looked like there were thousands of little lights, and between each one, I could see a spot that wasn't illuminated. The light was the purest and cleanest, whiter than white itself, he said. More UFOs started to show up at the airport, he said, generally between 6:30 at night and 2 a.m. And he started trying to contact them. He thought that maybe he could contact them and they could sit down together and have a meeting, and he could find out what was going on. So he sent the Morse code to them via signal light from the control tower, and he said the UFOs responded to my control tower light gun signals. They moved away when I hit them with a 20-millimeter wide red laser pointer. So he was attracting attention. And then he attempted to make contact by setting up a landing area and trying to signal them in. This is what he wrote. I set up 500 feet of red rope lighting, then attached the lighting to pre-cut 2x4s and set it up in the field like a giant arrow pointing to a green circle with an X in the center. I thought they would surely land, he said. No dice. They would show up when I least expected it. I learned to have a camera with me no matter where I would go. And he ended up setting up about a dozen game cameras around the airport. He ended up setting up cameras inside his apartment. He really became very involved in trying to document information about what was going on there. And he actually did have a MUFON field investigator go out there. He interviewed him. And then they went out onto the runway, and lo and behold, the MUFON investigator saw a UFO at only about 1,000 feet away. Now, I don't know if this is the same UFO, but this is a photograph that Mel took of the UFO, and you can see an enlargement that I made of it. Just some more perplexing lights at the airport. He was having more and more of this going on as time went on. And then in November of 2010, he was on the telephone in the middle of the night. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. His sister was working overseas at the time, so they would talk to each other on the telephone in the middle of the night. So he was up, and he happened to just look out the window in the door that led from the apartment out toward the hangar, and lo and behold, he saw 4 entities standing out there. One, he said, was about 6 foot tall. It was kind of flesh-colored, tan-colored. It had horizontal eyes with lids. And its face, he said, was not exactly like this sketch. He said there was no clothing, but its body had none of the characteristics of a naked human body. And then there were these 3 other little entities who were about 3.5 feet, 4 feet tall. He said they were robotic looking. Their skin was so white that it almost glowed. And he said they moved in unison. And it caused him to think that they might be robots. And they were wearing little silver suits. Very strange, very startling. He was not aware of missing time. I asked him about, did you report this to your sister? What happened? He didn't know what had happened. He just had no memory of it. And then something strange landed at the airport on December 18, 2010, and he thought that was a UFO, an extraterrestrial craft. So you can see that it kind of glows. It doesn't have crisp, clean lines. I don't know if it is from the lighting or if there's some kind of plasma around it, but in the front you can see a shed. And that does have crisp, clean lines. So we know that the camera wasn't moving. And he also took this video that I'm going to play next. He told me that he had taken dozens of videos and also probably close to 1,000 photographs. And he had them all stored in a hard drive. And the computer sort of melted, had a meltdown, and the terminals to the hard drive melted. And so he sent them to somebody in Dallas, and they were going to try to extract the photographs, but they were never able to do that. These are some other photographs that were taken. I don't know if those are light orbs on the left side or not, or if it's just, dust particles rising up. That could be. But on the right side, you can see a red orb. And he was seeing a lot of orbs around the airport and also inside his apartment. And one night, he touched a UFO. This is what he said. The night the small semi-disc-shaped craft zipped down on top of us, it caught us all off guard. I ducked down as I thought it was going to land on us, but it didn't. I was the only one who didn't freeze up, and I began to do a little walk around looking at it, trying to find a seam or even a row of fasteners. There was nothing, he said. So I stood on the tips of my toes and stretched out as far as I could and dragged my fingers across its surface about 12 to 14 inches, and then I fell back flat on my feet. That's when it sprayed us with a mist of thick, yellowish fluid. The fluid did not react with our bare skin or clothing. I didn't have it on me for more than 3 to 5 minutes. I peeled off my clothing as I sprinted to the shower. I didn't see it leave. I was gone probably 15 minutes, showering, changing clothes, and walking back out. It was gone by that point, and so was everybody else who was there. He also described what appeared to be non-physical UFOs, and he said that they were shaped like the old-fashioned farmer's hat type UFOs that were reported back in the early 50s. On the right, you can see a photograph that was taken back in 1952, not by Mel. But on the left is Mel's photo of what appears to me to be the same shaped UFO. And he said that they would come around and they would just dive into the ground and disappear, leaving no marks whatsoever on the ground. It was the strangest thing. And he said that he started shooting at them. So he was a gun enthusiast anyway. So when a UFO would come, he would shoot at it, and he could hear the bullets ping off some of them. But he didn't hear the bullets ping off others. And he even went to the extent of lying mesh down on the ground where that UFO would dive in to try to capture it. And he said that he was never able to capture that either. He went to great lengths to try to capture evidence here. And he wrote, I could see very distinctly different old men's faces in these orbs. Baboon faces were also a common appearance, but the majority seemed to be that of a goat. And he said there were several entities which had the appearance of the face of a goat. So these were kind of very strange non-human entities that he was observing. And you can see the arrow shows one of these orbs that he said had a face inside of it. Even with my photo program, I really could not make out the face inside that orb. It's just too small, taken from too far a distance for me. He also started to see ghostly apparitions. His mother and him saw a woman who was dressed in 1940s or 1950s clothing, and she was always holding an infant. And they knew that this was a ghostly apparition because they could see through her. She wasn't entirely solid. And he also started to see ghostly apparitions of a young woman who would always appear in the same area on the ramp. And he said that she was wailing at the top of her lungs. Probably a dozen more times he saw her. Her clothing always appeared to be ripped, as if she had been in an accident. And he said there were 2 women killed on that airport in separate crashes, and he always wondered if she was one of them. And then maybe time slips. It got more and more bizarre as time went on. And he said, and this is a quote, "Toward the north end of the airport at night, you would see, you should have seen runway edge lights, which were white, and runway end lights, which were red." He said one night, in its place was a scene in broad daylight with what appeared to be a grassy savanna, with half a dozen very hairy elephants walking across the open area. Nowhere in the photos did the runway or the runway control building appear. He said, "I think the elephants were woolly mammoths," close quote. Very strange time slips, possibly. He said, "I was shooting photos out of my open back office window when this creature," and that's the one that I showed you where I had outlined it, "this creature zips across the grassy area, stopping directly in front of me, no more than 12 inches from each other." He said, "I like to have had a stroke," and I bet he did too. It reminds me a little bit of what we see of maybe a mantis being. Very strange. And then I talked about possible plasma-charged boundaries between parallel universes. I can't tell you if that's what is in this photograph or if this is just dust blowing up and dust orbs, but it was pretty perplexing, and he submitted it to me as evidence. And then one night, this is after his wife left him, she couldn't take it any longer. He was sleeping alone in bed, and he wrote, "I was sound asleep when I woke up with a start. The first thing that hit me was that I was totally frozen lying in bed. So I'd gotten to that, and I'm going, oh, he must have had a sleep paralysis, maybe with a hypnagogic hallucination or hypnopompic hallucination." And so he's lying totally frozen in bed. He said, "I couldn't move a muscle, only my eyes worked." You know, that's characteristic of sleep paralysis. And he said, "At the end of the bed stood a being. It stood about 6 feet tall. Its head was totally devoid of any hair. Its eyes were huge, almond-shaped, and looked as if they covered most of his face. Curling around the edges of the head were ears. Where ears should have been were simply holes," he said. So he got a really good look at this thing. And this is something that I've put together that might be something like the non-human he was observing. He said, "Its nose was barely noticeable, just a small ridge with 2 holes for nostrils. Its mouth amounted to no more than a slit, no lips. Its skin color and texture was like ours, smooth and tanned in color." And the next thing that he wrote was quite startling. He said, "At this point, I'd gotten used to sleeping with my Glock 17 in my right hand, round in the chamber. As I lay there screaming in my head at the horror that I was staring at, with all my might, I mentally forced my right hand up and aiming for its mid-torso, I squeezed off one round, striking it dead center. It immediately doubled over, then disappeared in a blinding blue flash." He said, "I immediately jumped out of bed and turned the lights on. All over the foot of my bed and the wooden laminate flooring was a yellowish, thick fluid. Would I have loved to have collected that for analysis, but it was before I started to investigate his case. This happened when no one wanted to touch his case. The UFO investigators said, it's paranormal. The paranormal investigators said, we can't investigate this, it's UFO. This happens so often that an individual is left alone with this going on. Terribly frightening, terribly distressing, trying to collect evidence, and has nobody who is really seriously interested in what is going on at this point. Well, his attitude began to change. He said, after a year and a half, I began to see these objects, at least part of them, as not some race of beings thousands of years ahead of us from some far-flung galaxy. I started seeing what could only be described as evil. That was quite strange, so I needed to find out what his religious background was, and I also talked to his friend who saw he was a witness as well to some of this phenomena, and come to find out his friend, who had been a Texas state trooper, was a born-again Christian who believed that all of this was demonic. And Mel was Roman Catholic and wasn't quite sure. He did call a priest in. The priest blessed the house. He ended up putting a crucifix over the top of every door and every window, hoping that this would all stop. It didn't. It continued. My question is, are both positive and negative entities from the multiverse entering through interdimensional portals? And it makes me wonder if these extraterrestrial entities, because I do believe that we are being visited by extraterrestrials, if they are coming in and maybe opening up portals, maybe that's part of their technology. And when these portals are open, is it possible that other entities are slipping in from other dimensions, maybe the way flies slip in when we open the front door to invite a guest in? I don't know. I have to tell you, a lot of times I know I have the answers, but I'm still investigating this. But I found so much information that I wanted to share it with you today. Well, one night he was again alone in bed, and he woke up during the night by this bright light in his bedroom. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. And in that light, he said that he saw what he thought was an angel. It was a woman with flowing black hair, and she was dressed in this sort of glowing white gown. And standing behind her was a man who was naked, and he had black hair too. And so in his mind, in his interpretation, this was an angel protecting him from a demon. And he said that this went on for several hours. By then he had an infrared thermometer, and so he pointed that at this, what he thought was an angel, and it was 18 degrees cooler than the ambient temperature in the bedroom. So just that area was 18 degrees cooler. Normally, paranormal investigators will say when something is cooler like that, it might be a negative kind of energy or entity. And I don't know if this is actually related to the experiences that he was having, but the hangar floor shook one day, and a 60-foot crack just opened up in the floor. And then a substance started oozing out of that crack. I don't know if chemicals had been dumped and dumped and dumped underneath that floor, before the hangar was built there, and that's what was going on. I know there wasn't a volcano under there, But, I don't have the answers. And for so many of these things, we just don't have the answers. But they appear to be there. This is what it looked like at night. Molten rock, looked like lava. This was his statement in 2014. He said, I started to investigate his case in 2014, but I was very, very busy writing books, promoting books, that sort of thing, so I could only do it on a part-time basis. And he wrote, "I don't think an alien body draped over the hood of my pickup, driving around town and circling the courthouse would convince people. It's the most aggravating thing I have ever been involved in," he said. Well, in 2016, as soon as I had finished writing Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers with Stan Friedman, we started communicating on a daily basis then. And he wrote, his statement for 2016 is, "I just can't believe people in the year 2016 refuse to accept anything about this subject. Some of the evidence out there would undeniably hold up in a court of law. Yet the video and still photographs that I have captured of these things are not taken seriously." He said, "I just don't get it." So I want to say, first of all, that before I talk about this, that Mel ended up having his health fail. When all of this started in 2010, he was in very good shape, physically fit, no problems. As this occurred more and more, and after the yellow kind of thick substance was released by the UFO onto him, I don't know if it had an impact on his health or not, but he developed serious cardiovascular problems. And he thought that just being at that airport, at that business, with these entities around that he considered to be demonic, was affecting his health. And one day, he just got into his pickup truck and he drove away. He left his business. He lost a lot of money, but he felt he had to get away from that. And if he didn't get away, that he was probably going to be a dead man. Some of the mistakes that I think that he made are that he called in these entities without adequate knowledge. He really didn't know very much about them at all. At the time he started to call in these UFOs and wanted to set up a meeting to talk to these entities. He believed that he could meet with them, but then later he started shooting guns at them. He developed a belligerent attitude. He used violent force against them, shooting one, and he exhibited fear and negativity. And that kind of fear and negativity, particularly if there are negative entities around, tends to be something that they look for, something that they feed off from. So maybe this is what was happening here. This is Mel's reflection upon his events. He said, "Hopefully, people, if ever confronted with the same thing, can fall back on my experiences and not have to suffer from some of the health issues that came from being too close to this." So my questions are, could multidimensional, non-human entities be interacting with us through breaches in membranes between worlds caused by electromagnetic fields or natural portals? And are some of these entities voyagers from distant planets using advanced technology to open up dimensional portals? Or are these portals just here? It's all very perplexing. I've been researching this for about 5 years now, and 5 years is not a very long time to find answers for this kind of thing. I have been working more recently with Paul Eno. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he has a radio show out of Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island, and he studied to be a priest. And he was studying to be an exorcist, studying demonology, and he went through college while he was a priest. He went through 2 colleges, and then the Catholic Church became very concerned about the paranormal work that he was doing and his attitudes, because he was beginning to form different opinions than the Catholic Church's opinions. And so he ended up leaving the priesthood. They asked him to leave. He has a master's degree in journalism. He has worked, he married, had children, worked most of his life as a journalist. He's the editor of a newspaper. And he has worked in the paranormal field as an investigator for many, many years, and I consider him to be an expert in the field. So he and I have been cooperating together on this case, and we have agreed that we're going to start working together on some of his cases and on some of my cases, because we're finding that so often they overlap. We just can't understand it. And here are the 4 books that I've written, 3 with Stanton Friedman. Our new book is Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. And the other one, The Alien Abduction Files with Denise Stoner, whom you saw an interview with. She is also an experiencer, and she wrote about some of her experiences in the alien abduction files, and I am the investigator on her case. I didn't know her well at all when I started to investigate her case. At that point, she was the chief investigator for Florida MUFON. I was living in New Hampshire. I had moved to Florida, attended one of her meetings, and that's where we met. She had not made her experiences public to many people at that time, but I attended one of her experiencer sessions, and she invited me to dinner or lunch with her at her home. So we set up an appointment. I went over for lunch, and she sat down, and she started telling me that she was an experiencer, that she had been, and her husband and her daughter were living in Arvada, Colorado. And this is back in 1982 that the first experience happened with the family. They were every single Friday night during the summer, they would drive from Arvada down to Buena Vista, where they had a camping trailer. And Denise's mother, her parents, had a camping trailer too. And on this particular night, and everything was like clockwork, her husband had been in the military. And on this particular night, 1982, as they were driving along, they were descending a pass and going into the small town of Jefferson. And suddenly, these lights started coming at them. They felt like the car was being lifted up off the road. And immediately I thought, oh, well, maybe they had an accident, maybe they were knocked unconscious and then they woke up. But that wasn't what happened. They continued being taken off the road and onto the desert floor, where they were taken from their vehicle onto this craft. And it's all in the alien abduction files. The first third of the book is about her experience. The next thing they knew, and this was about 6 o'clock in the evening when this happened, it was still daylight. The next thing they knew, they were 40 miles away on the pass at the other end of South Park Valley. And it was now nearly 11 o'clock at night. It was dark, They were cold, they were shaking, they were startled, they didn't know what had happened. They drove on to Buena Vista, and her parents were frantic. There were no cell phones back then. They were in the process of walking down to the ranch to ask to use the phone to call the highway patrol to see if there had been any accidents. And Denise and Ed Stoner had no idea what had happened, except for they were missing this time. So Denise came to believe, I did not do any hypnosis on her as a young child, but she came to believe that she had been taken from the time she was a child. She wrote about it in our book as well. So that's the end of my lecture. Let's see what time. I have about 8 minutes left. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Yes?
Two questions. One, did anybody bother to dig up... Did anybody... Is it a on?
No, I can't hear it.
Should work. All right. Did anybody bother to dig up those floorboards at the gentleman's home and extract the yellow liquid? And the second question
Yeah,
is...
it was concrete. It was a crack, and it has not been dug up, as far as I know.
No, you said that aliens appeared at the foot of his bed, and he shot the man.
No, because no one would go out and investigate. I had actually set up a photographic team to go out and document this with me this spring, and Mel died.
Are the floorboards still there?
I don't know if they're still there. Paul Eno and I are working on that now. We're going to try to get out there to do another investigation on site.
You also mentioned electronics disturbance after a meeting with an entity. Does it happen immediately after a contact experience, or do these electronics blow up days and weeks after the contact?
It generally happens immediately after an experience. I wrote about that in the case of Jenny Henderson in the alien abduction files as well, where she had an experience and the next morning everything she touched sort of just blew up or blew out. The hairdryer, the electric mixer, one thing after another in succession. Denise and I have actually used a tri-field meter, and we have attempted to record maybe electrical fields, electromagnetic fields around experiencers' bodies right after they have had contact or reported it. And what we found is that the highest reading we got on the electrical scale was 1,000 volts per meter from 10 feet away. We had checked the ambient environment first, did not react that way. We also used control subjects. One of them was my husband because it was at my house, but it did not react that way for him, and it did not react that way for Denise's husband or Denise's daughter. Denise was one of those subjects, and it did happen for her. You're welcome.
Have you ever tried to find out, for all the people you've investigated, have you ever tried to find out their blood type? And the reason I ask that is because in many cases, some have found out that a lot of the people that have had, a lot of experiencers have Rh negative, which is a very rare blood type. It's not really known why, but some believe that it could be like it's a royal bloodline. And while I'm at it, how's progress going on getting captured, being turned into a movie?
Yes, well, Daryl Sims was one of the first investigators to look into that. He found elevated Rh negative blood. Denise and I asked that question on our questionnaire, but so few people knew their blood type that we really couldn't get good evidence, even though there was an elevated Rh negative level. MUFON has asked that on our questionnaire now, and I will have those results, but I don't have them today.
When Mel decided to build the airport, they checked to see whether there was any Native American site there?
It abutted Native American land.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So maybe that's where traditionally poor, because they usually talk about sites that are good and sites that are bad.
Yes,
And you could call it Chinese geomancy, or in Europe ley lines, but we don't. We're supposedly rational.
Yes, that's one of the first things I thought about, in fact, is, the natives talk about evil spirits, and, maybe that was the area where the evil spirits were appearing. I don't know, but, it's very, very bizarre, very strange. You're welcome.
Yeah, I have a comment that this is very reminiscent of some things that have happened at the Bradshaw Ranch.
Yes.
And up at the Skinwalker Ranch.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you've thought of any correlations there. I also wonder if you know the date and time that the crack opened up in the hangar, and have you tried to look at seismic activity in the area?
There was no seismic activity in the area when that occurred.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you very much.